Did you know that in 1923, while cities like New York and London were choking on the smoke from gasoline engines, Mexico City was different? There was no deafening noise here, no black cloud hanging over the avenues. Silent electric trams ran along 318 kilometers of tracks, connecting the main square to distant towns. And the wealthiest families drove imported electric cars. Baker Electric, Detroit Electric. Silent, clean, elegant vehicles. They were the ultimate status symbol. If you had money, you did not want a dirty gasoline car that you had to crank start by hand. You wanted electricity. Mexico was decades ahead of its time, but starting in 1921, a new reality began to take over. Mexico became the second largest oil producer in the world, and that changed everything. This is the story of how black gold buried Mexico's electric future, and how, 100 years later, we are trying to get it back. January 15th, 1900, was a historic date for Mexico. President Porfirio Diaz inaugurated the first electric tram line connecting the main square to the town of San Angel, 15 kilometers of pure modernity. Before that, mule-pulled trams dominated the streets. They took an hour and a half to cover what an electric tram did in 40 minutes. By 1910, the electric tram network already covered 318 kilometers. It connected the center with Coyoacán, Azcapotzalco, Xochimilco, Tlalpan, the village of Guadalupe, and in the 1920s, that system carried 300,000 passengers a day. Mexico had one of the most advanced electric transportation networks in the world. But if trams were the transport for the masses, private electric cars were the supreme luxury. In the United States, brands like Baker Electric and Detroit Electric dominated the luxury car market, and rich Mexicans imported them. The Baker Electric cost between $800 and $4,000 in 1910. It was 3 or 4 times more expensive than a Ford Model T, but that did not matter because the Baker was not just transportation, it was distinction. You did not need to crank start the engine like with gasoline cars. You did not get your hands dirty with oil, there was no smoke, no noise, you just pressed a button and it worked. The Detroit Electric promised 80 miles of range on a single charge, and in special tests under ideal conditions, it reached 340 kilometers. By 1912, Clara Ford, yes, the wife of Henry Ford, drove a 1914 Detroit Electric Brougham. She used it until the 1930s. If the wife of the man who was going to kill the electric car preferred an electric one, that tells us something. Let me put this in perspective for you about what was happening in the world. Between 1900 and 1912, electric cars dominated American cities. They were preferred by women and wealthy families precisely because they were clean, quiet, and easy to drive. In 1906, the Baker Motor Vehicle Company produced 800 electric cars a year. It was the largest manufacturer in the world at that time. By 1910, there were maps of charging stations in New York that covered up to Boston and Philadelphia. Electric cars were not experiments, they were the present. And in Mexico, although they were not manufactured, they were used. Porfirian families, businessmen, high-ranking officials, they all wanted their Baker or Detroit Electric. Now, here is something many people do not know. Mexico did not manufacture complete cars, but it had something few nations had: world-class coach builders. The chassis, the motor, the wheels, the basic structure came from the United States, but the bodywork, the finishes, the customization, that was done in Mexico. Mexican workshops transformed a basic chassis into a luxury car, adapted to the climate, to the uneven streets, to Mexican tastes. That tradition of Mexican coach builders was legendary. It came from the era of horse-drawn carriages. And when automobiles arrived, they simply adapted their craft. And even more impressive, Mexican engineers were developing home charging systems, what we would call wall boxes today, domestic chargers. In private garages in Mexico City, in Monterrey, in Guadalajara, wealthy families installed these systems to charge their electric cars. Mexico was literally decades ahead. And then, everything changed. In 1911, Mexico produced 12.5 million barrels of oil a year. By 1918, that figure had jumped to almost 64 million barrels. Mexico accounted for more than 12% of world production. And in 1921, Mexico reached its peak, 193 million barrels. Mexico became the second largest oil producer in the world, just behind the United States. It produced between 20 and 25% of the world's oil. But here is the crucial detail. Mexico was the world's top oil exporter. Why? Because the United States produced more, but consumed it all domestically. Mexico, on the other hand, sent almost all its oil abroad. Mexico powered the world, but it did not power itself. Companies like Huasteca Petroleum from Edward Doheny and Mexican Eagle from Wheatman Pearson controlled millions of hectares in Veracruz. The Golden Lane in the Huasteca was the richest oil field on the planet. And what happened? The Mexican government saw something no country could ignore: money, a lot of money. By 1921, the oil industry contributed a third of the federal government's revenues. A third. It was easier to collect taxes on every exported barrel of oil than to invest in a complex and costly national electric grid. Mexico was swimming in oil. Why invest in electricity? But there is something else that accelerated this change. World War I showed that oil was the strategic resource of the 20th century. Between 1914 and 1918, Mexico produced almost 220 million barrels. Of those, 173 million were exported. 79%. Where did that oil go? To the United States, and from there to England. The British Navy had converted its ships from coal to oil, and Mexico was one of its main suppliers. Mexican oil powered the Allies' war machine, and when the war ended, the United States, which already consumed more oil than anyone, needed even more. Between 1918 and 1921, Mexico was crucial for the United States at a time when its own reserves were declining. Oil was not just money, it was geopolitical power, and Mexico had it. This is where the Mexican government made the decision that changed everything. It was more lucrative to extract oil and sell it abroad than to develop internal electric infrastructure. Investments went to oil wells, refineries, pipelines, not to power plants, not to electricity distribution networks for the country. Electric cars needed accessible electricity, they needed public charging stations, they needed a stable grid, but the government bet on oil, and with oil came cheap gasoline. If Mexico produced millions of barrels, gasoline in the domestic market was abundant and inexpensive. Why would anyone pay $4,000 for a Baker Electric when they could buy a Ford Model T for $850 that ran on super cheap gasoline? And here comes the perfect villain in this story: Henry Ford. Not out of malice, but out of brutal efficiency. In 1908, Ford launched the Model T, initial price $825. But Ford had a plan. In 1913, he introduced the moving assembly line in his Highland Park factory. Workers no longer moved around the car moved between the workers. The assembly time for a chassis dropped from 12 hours to 93 minutes, and with that, the price plummeted. By 1916, the Model T cost $360. By 1922, it cost $265. By 1925, barely $260. Remember that a Baker cost $2,800? Ford was selling cars for less than a tenth of that price. And not only that, Ford produced on a massive scale. In 1921, the Model T represented 57% of all cars produced in the world. 15 million units were made between 1908 and 1927. Artisanal electric cars simply could not compete. In 1912 came the death blow for electric cars. Cadillac introduced the electric starter on its gasoline cars. You no longer needed the crank. You no longer risked breaking your arm trying to start the engine. You pressed a button, just like in an electric car. The only real advantage electric cars had, the ease of starting, had just disappeared. And with cheap oil, with Ford flooding the market, with the electric starter eliminating the crank problem, electric cars were pushed out of the market for decades. By 1920, the Baker Motor Vehicle Company had merged with other manufacturers and stopped producing passenger cars in 1916. Detroit Electric held on until 1939, but only producing units on special order. The last Detroit Electric was shipped on February 23, 1939, and with that, electric cars disappeared from the world market for almost 50 years. And here comes the uncomfortable question. Did Mexico choose wrong, or did it just choose what seemed inevitable? Because the reality is that Mexico could have been a leader in electric mobility. It had the trams. It had trained engineers, it had workshops that knew how to work with bodywork and adaptations, but it never developed the electric grid necessary to support a fleet of private electric cars. In 1900, Mexico City had electricity, but it was limited. Most of the electric investment was for the trams, not for widespread domestic use. Rural electrification in Mexico would not arrive until decades later, and by the time it did, it was too late. The world had moved to gasoline. The decision to bet on oil had lasting consequences. Mexico became dependent on oil exports. The economy revolved around oil. When in 1938, Lázaro Cárdenas expropriated the foreign oil companies and created Pemex, it consolidated that dependence. It was not bad to nationalize oil, but it meant that for almost 100 years, Mexico bet everything on a single resource. And meanwhile, electric mobility was forgotten. Electric trams began to disappear in the 1950s and 60s. The last major tram accident in 1963, which killed 63 people, marked the beginning of the end. In 1985, the earthquake finally shut down the tram system. Mexico filled up with gasoline cars, diesel microbuses, polluting trucks. Mexico City, which in 1920 was quiet and clean, became one of the most polluted cities on the planet. Imagine for a moment an alternate Mexico, a Mexico where the government had invested in electric grids as aggressively as it invested in oil wells. A Mexico where the coach builder workshops had evolved into full-fledged electric car manufacturers. A Mexico where the electrical engineering tradition from the trams had expanded to automobiles. We could have been Tesla, 80 years before Tesla, but that story never happened. Oil was too tempting, too easy, too lucrative, and so Mexico lost its chance. Fast forward to 2017. After almost a century of total dominance by oil and gasoline, something starts to change in Mexico. And for almost 80 years, Mexico did not try to manufacture an electric car again until someone decided to break that rule. A businessman named Jorge Martinez, director of the country's largest parking company, saw the same problem every day. Mexico City drowning in traffic, pollution, noise, and he had an idea. Why not create the first Mexican electric car? It did not matter that Tesla already existed. It did not matter that the Nissan Leaf was already on the market. The question was, can Mexico manufacture its own electric cars? Martinez partnered with electrical and mechanical engineers, and in 2017, he founded Zasua. The name comes from a bird endemic to southeastern Mexico, the zacuan, which was supposedly the favorite of Emperor Moctezuma, a nod to Mexican history, a symbol that this was genuinely Mexican. In 2018, Zacua inaugurated its assembly plant in Puebla. And here is the interesting part. The process is artisanal. Each car is assembled by hand. Does that sound familiar? It is exactly what Mexican coach builders did in the 1920s with imported Baker and Detroit electric cars. A century later, Mexico is returning to its artisanal roots. Zacua launched two models, the MX-2 and the MX-3. Compact urban cars, two-seaters, top speed of 85 kilometers per hour, range of 160 to 200 kilometers. They are not cars for highways, they are cars for the city, for daily traffic, for errands. Price, 569,000 pesos in 2019, close to 600,000 pesos now. It is expensive for the average Mexican, let us not deny it, but it is cheaper than a Tesla Model 3 or a Nissan Leaf. What is fascinating about Zacua is that the car's electronics were developed in Mexico. It is not a rebranded Chinese car. It is not a European design with a Mexican label. The control technology, the battery system, the integration, all that was done in Puebla. They have technological independence. They own that technology. And the long-term goal is to have 100% of the parts manufactured in Mexico, something no brand in the world has fully achieved. Currently, the bodywork is from the French company Châtenay, but the motorization and final assembly are 100% Mexican. Zacua faces the same problems that Baker and Detroit Electric faced 100 years ago. Price: artisanal cars are expensive to produce. Infrastructure: although there are more charging stations than in 1920, Mexico still does not have a sufficient network. Perception: do you trust a Mexican car when you can buy a German, Japanese, or Korean one with 100 years of automotive tradition? But Zacua has sold more than 100 units, has created a community of loyal users, has proven that it works, and in 2025, they plan to launch 5 new models. In October of 2024, President Claudia Sheinbaum announced that her government will promote Olea, another Mexican electric car project. Some criticized her for presenting Olea as the first when Zacua had already been on the market for years, but in reality, it does not matter. What is important is that finally, the Mexican government is seeing electric mobility as a priority. After 100 years of betting only on oil, Mexico is recognizing that the future is electric. And here is the brutal irony of this whole story. In 1920, Mexico had oil, but it bet on it and abandoned electricity. In 2025, Mexico has oil, but the whole world is abandoning oil for electricity. We are trying to recover what we threw away a century ago. Zacua is, unknowingly, the continuation of those Mexican engineers who in the 1920s installed home charging systems for Baker Electrics. It is the continuation of those coach builders who adapted imported chassis to Mexican needs. It is proof that Mexico can manufacture electric cars. It always could, we just forgot for 100 years. This story teaches us something fundamental about economic decisions. In 1920, betting on oil seemed like the obvious choice. It was abundant, valuable, strategic. But that decision closed off an alternate future, a future where Mexico could have been a world leader in electric mobility, a future where our cities never choked on smog, a future where our economy did not depend on a single depletable resource. But here is the good part. We have a second chance. The whole world is returning to electric cars, and this time, Mexico has to be ready. Zacua proved that it is possible, that there is talent, that there is technical capacity. What is missing is investment, infrastructure, consistent government support, and above all, changing the mindset. For a century, Mexicans believed we could not manufacture cars, that we could only assemble foreign designs, but that is false. The same engineers who adapted Baker Electrics in 1920 live today in Zacua's engineers. The same tradition of artisanal coach builders lives in the hands that assemble each MX2 and MX3 in Puebla. Mexico always had the capacity. We just needed to remember it. If you see a Mexican electric car, it is the story of what we could have been. It is the reminder of a decision made 100 years ago that changed our destiny. It is proof that it is never too late to correct course. In 1923, Mexico made electric cars. Well, it adapted them, improved them, made them work on our streets until oil displaced them. But 100 years later, we are back, and this time, we are not going to make the same mistake. The future is electric, and Mexico is finally ready to be part of it.